Today we're talking about the legendary COBRA, the first dedicated attack helicopter. We will tell you about its armament, its role in the Vietnam War, and at the end you'll hear two true horror stories from missions where everything went wrong. So, let's begin. The concept of attack helicopters emerged from the need for close and precise air support. Even back in the Second World War and the Korean War, it was noticed that fixed-wing aircraft, although they had enormous destructive power, often had limited ability in certain terrains to help pin down ground forces when the enemy was close by. It could take them more than 30 minutes to mobilize and get into action, and they didn't have enough precision to provide close support exactly where it was needed, while still keeping it safe for friendly units. They also couldn't stay over the battlefield long enough. Helicopters, on the other hand, proved to be versatile, capable of hovering and operating in areas where traditional aircraft couldn't. This would be demonstrated in the Vietnam War, where helicopters became the best solution for supporting ground units in jungles, mountains, and narrow valleys. New tactics in the Vietnam War were based on troops being delivered by UH-1 Hueys, sometimes bringing them directly into the fight. For transport, extraction, resupply, and medevac, Hueys were great. But it became clear that unarmed troop helicopters were extremely vulnerable to enemy fire as they approached landing zones. Operating deep within enemy territory, the only way to prepare and suppress the landing zone was from the air. So, they needed an aircraft that could escort the helicopters and stay with the troops on the ground to support them. Early in the war, some Hueys were armed with machine guns and rocket pods. These first gunship versions were used to support transport helicopters. But the problem was that they carried extra weight, could barely keep up with the rest of the force, and were highly vulnerable to enemy fire, lacking the speed, maneuverability, and firepower needed for high-intensity combat. So a special aircraft had to be built for this purpose. It was crafted from the DNA of the Bell UH-1 Huey, but transformed into something much deadlier. Using the Huey's proven engine and rotor system, Bell Helicopter engineered the COBRA with a sleek, narrow design built exclusively for combat. Introduced in 1967 during the height of the Vietnam War, it would go directly into action to prove its worth and quickly gather stories people would talk about. Its slick, narrow fuselage, less than 9 feet wide, created less than a third of the drag of a standard helicopter and presented a smaller target for enemy fire. Its compact design made the COBRA highly maneuverable, ideal for low-altitude battles. It could travel up to about 170 miles per hour, making it perfect for rapid response. The COBRA was operated by a pilot and a co-pilot/gunner seated in a stepped tandem arrangement. With the gunner in front operating the weapon systems, he had an unobstructed view and could deliver devastating firepower exactly where needed. They were protected by tempered steel seats and some light armor around the cockpit and vital parts of the helicopter, reducing the chance of catastrophic failure if hit, without compromising speed and agility. Both positions had flight controls, so the crew could quickly switch who was flying if one was incapacitated, since typically both crew members were certified pilots. Crews relied on maneuverability, firepower, and tactical flying to avoid being hit. COBRAs always operated in groups of 2 or more aircraft, rarely alone, and flying low and fast helped them stay under the radar, though it was extremely dangerous in unpredictable terrain and heavy weather. Remember, they usually carried only 2 crew members, but sometimes this changed. For example, Captain Ronald Fogelman was shot down in his F-100 Super Sabre over enemy territory, and his rescue came from AH-1G. He was the only pilot to be rescued by holding onto the gun panel door from the outside, but something similar would happen again in an even wilder story you'll hear at the end. The AH-1 COBRA was a heavily armed platform with customizable weapon systems that allowed it to carry different payloads depending on the mission. A 20mm 3-barrel rotary cannon or a 7.62 minigun could be mounted in the chin turret, covering a wide range of angles. It could also have a dual 40mm grenade launcher or a combination with a minigun or cannon. 2.75-inch Hydra 70 rockets were carried in underwing pods, with variations such as fragmentation, smoke, or illumination, and up to 38 rockets could be loaded. Later, COBRAs were equipped with AGM-22 TOW missiles for anti-armor or fortified positions. In comparison to armed UH-1s, the COBRA could carry twice as much ammunition and had 3 times the loiter time. It could arrive at a designated landing zone ahead of the transport helicopters, prepare the terrain, provide support when they arrived, and wait for them to withdraw, covering them and offering protection. The first 6 Cobras arrived in Vietnam on August 30th, 1967, and were soon put into combat. Around 1,100 Cobras were deployed in Vietnam, and approximately 300 were either shot down or lost in accidents. The greatest threat was enemy anti-aircraft fire from 50 caliber or 20 mm weapons. Later in the war, Soviet surface-to-air missiles became the biggest danger to all aircraft. However, sometimes just one lucky shot from an AK or a sniper rifle could hit a critical component and bring down the aircraft. Since Cobras often flew low, they were frequently exposed to such threats. The hunter-killer team tactic was perhaps one of the most terrifying strategies used in Vietnam, especially involving the OH-6 Loach scout helicopters that basically acted as bait. Cobras and Loaches worked together to locate and destroy enemy positions. The Loach would fly low and slow, exposing itself to enemy fire. When it drew fire, the Loach usually dropped smoke grenades to mark the enemy positions. The Cobra, hovering higher and out of sight, would then swoop in and unleash its firepower on the marked targets. This tactic was effective at finding and destroying enemy positions, but it placed huge risks on the bait helicopters, who were often shot down, with some crews being downed more than a dozen times. Now, get ready for the stories. The first incident happened on June 18, 1968, when First Lieutenant Taylor and his fire team of 2 Cobras were urgently called on a nighttime mission. A 4-member long-range reconnaissance patrol deep in enemy territory looked through their night vision and realized they were completely surrounded by a much stronger enemy force. They immediately requested aerial fire support. When the Cobras arrived, the patrol was already in heavy fighting. First Lieutenant Taylor requested artillery illumination, and after locating the team on the ground, the 2 COBRA gunships conducted dangerous low-altitude attack runs despite heavy enemy fire. They fired rockets and machine guns at the enemy around the patrol, preventing them from being overrun. This lasted for 45 minutes, and enemy fire only intensified. The Cobras were running low on ammo and fuel. The ground evacuation route to the landing zone, where a Huey could land, was not an option as the enemy was closing in. Seeing that they would soon run out of fuel, Taylor completely disregarded all protocols and safety and went in with an outright crazy plan. He instructed the patrol to move 100 yards away to a small clearing, then turned on his searchlights to draw enemy fire at himself, giving the team on the ground an opportunity to move. His wingman emptied the remaining ammunition to shed as much weight as possible, as they now had to make a 25-minute flight with calculations showing only 20 minutes of fuel. Under cover of the last rounds from the second Cobra, Taylor landed under heavy fire and instructed the patrol team to grab hold of anything they could. 4 men jumped onto the rocket pods and skids, clinging for their lives as Taylor flew them away to the nearest friendly location, saving them with this almost impossible action. Taylor was awarded the Silver Star for his actions that night, which was later upgraded to the Medal of Honor. The second story comes from a hunter-killer team mission that went horrifically wrong, as described in the memoirs of Captain Hugh Mills. It was January 29, 1972, and a pair of Cobras and OH-6 scout helicopters were conducting a routine reconnaissance mission that afternoon. Following them was a Huey carrying Rangers, ready for extraction if anyone was shot down. They received a call from a nearby unit reporting that an F-4 had been shot down and asked them to provide cover. They immediately headed to the area and began searching for the crash site. It was a heavily wooded area, and the Cobras hovered at about 6,000 feet, while the Loaches flew low passes. The Loaches soon made radio contact with the downed crew and began searching. After a couple of minutes, one Loach came under fire and immediately maneuvered, while the Cobras dove down and fired rockets at the enemy position. They made another sweep, and as Mills's Cobra fired its rockets, one of them malfunctioned. It tore off part of the pod and flew straight into the tail rotor, snapping it clean off. The Cobra immediately spun out of control, spiraling downward as it rapidly lost altitude. Within seconds, it hit the trees and crashed. Mills was unconscious for a while, and when he regained consciousness, he made contact with the Loach circling overhead. His co-pilot, John Bryant, was in critical condition with severe injuries, including a broken neck and back. After establishing communication, a Huey was dispatched for extraction, but because of the high trees around the crash site, its ropes couldn't reach the ground. The rescuers moved to an area with shorter trees, all while the enemy pressed closer to the crash site. Under mounting pressure, medics were eventually lowered on hoists and worked quickly to secure the injured pilots onto litters. Meanwhile, another Cobra provided cover until they hauled them to safety just in time. Both Mills and Bryant survived that mission and eventually recovered from their injuries.